How can you tell if your vagus nerve is working appropriately or not? So in today's video, we're going to finally get to the bottom of this. We're also going to talk about how crazy sensitive your heart can be to the environment, both internal and external. It's just crazy. It just seems to be responding to everything under the sun. And we're going to talk about heart rate variability, which is how you can measure performance of your vagus nerve, but it's counterintuitive. It's the more variable it is, the healthier the performance of the vagus nerve and the healthier you are. And you might be thinking it's the exact opposite. You might be thinking that it's the regular heartbeat that would be the healthiest. So it's, of course, that variation is very small. We're going to talk about all of those details today. And we're going to talk about it in a context of a paper that was testing the certified vagus nerve neuromodulation device that I'm promoting in my videos. I'm being sponsored by the company to talk about this technology. So since we're here, let's bring up the logo of the company and tell you that if you're interested in this instrument to stimulate your vagus nerve for health improvement, then the discount for the instrument is provided, or link for the discount is in this video description below. So check it out, might as well save yourself some money. Now, this particular paper specifically was testing an instrument produced by the same company, which is why this is an exciting way to tell you exactly how to monitor whether your autonomic nervous system is performing properly or not. My name is Dr. Mikhail Arashik of Genomics, and let's get going here. So one of my favorite things when I do these videos, when I study papers, is to read the introduction and descriptions, because this is where the scientific authors really get to shine and show off their collective knowledge that they have accumulated over the years. And it was fun to read the introduction because the authors mentioned, obviously, look, vagus brain is connected to your body, obviously, and vagus nerve is one of those important brain-body connections. We reviewed that extensively in one of the past videos, so check that out. But here, because we're going to be talking about the component of the vagus nerve that we want to measure whether it's healthy or not, and we're measuring this via looking at your heart, then specifically we want to focus on the cardiac component of your vagus nerve. So with the vagus nerve, in the process of studying for this particular article, I came across this very cool image that was made by some individual that showed how the vagus nerve travels through your body as well. So it and you can basically see it innervates your body, and of course it hits many of your organs, and that includes your heart. So specifically today we're talking about cardiac vagus nerve, and the authors mentioned, look, cardiac vagus nerve performance, proper performance, or basically appropriate level of sensitivity to respond to the environment, is linked with not only your increased health and well-being, but of course it also knows is that it's increased with overall personal relaxation, but even get this, your emotions, that including emotions such as empathy, which I thought was very cool, because I was like, I'm using this instrument myself. I don't mind if I become slightly more empathetic along the way. And we probably all can use with an extra dose of empathy, especially after the pandemic. So anyway, so that's the benefits, but contrary, when the vagal nerve, cardiac vagal nerve, is not performing optimally, that is linked to increased stress, but also even more dire situations such as increased morbidity and even mortality. So definitely not something that we want to be ignorant of when it comes to the power of the vagus nerve. And as a consequence, modulation of the activity of the vagus nerve has emerged as part of a new type of medicine called bioelectronic medicine. It's really interesting because this is basically how you can affect your health by manipulating how your nerves are performing. And when it comes to vagus nerve concept of its use in bioelectronic medicine, typically we will think of something like, of course, vagus nerve neuromodulation. But when you just say it like that, that's usually refers to invasive vagus nerve neuromodulation, and that has been shown, and the authors provided a bunch of references, that has been shown to work effectively for heart failure. mm, I think they mentioned chronic pain, but even obesity. So I thought it was interesting. But when it comes to the instrument that I discuss, we're talking about vagus nerve neuromodulation via your ear, because your vagus nerve can also innervate parts of your ear. So this lip on your ear is called tragus, and you can modulate your vagus nerve via that component. That's no longer invasive. That's non-invasive. And when you speak of this type of activation of your vagus nerve via such means, that usually refers to transcutaneous auricular vagus nerve neuromodulation. I'm just going to refer to it from now on as vagus nerve neuromodulation, because that's all we're going to be talking about for the rest of this article. But what I really like is what the authors mention in the introduction, is that this transcutaneous auricular vagus nerve neuromodulation has been shown to improve treatment of such conditions as cardiac complications, neurodegenerative complications, as well as chronic pain, inflammation, and even acute respiratory distress syndrome post COVID-19. And I was like astonished, because wow, think about this. This is some of the major complaints that everyone is talking about as a consequence of having problems post pandemic. So, and this vagus nerve neuromodulation via your ear seems to, there's data emerging that it can help with all of these complications. I've also made 2 videos with regards to science behind the long COVID, so check that out, as well as postural tachycardia POTS, so check that out as well. So clearly, very powerful technology, but it's still nascent, it's still emerging. We will still need to know a lot more data. And one of the things that is still missing is understanding is how different parameters should be used. Because get this, the authors, one of the coolest references that I can't wait to check out that they provided, is that the vagus nerve is involved in more than 100 human diseases. It's just absolutely astonishing, right? So we need to still figure out how to treat different conditions with different energy inputs, if you will, into your vagus nerve. And one of the most critical components to determine is the performance of these instruments, is how well they might influence your heart rate variability. All right, so that brings me now to heart rate variability. What is that? It basically is the variation of heartbeats that your heart can produce. And it's somewhat, like I mentioned, counterintuitive, because that variation in your heartbeats is influenced by many different physiological inputs, as well as even external environment, because if you see something, your heart can respond to that as well. And the greater that variation, the healthier you are. It's typically associated with healthier heart and overall healthier well-being for an entire individual. Why is that? It's because that increased variation indicates that your parasympathetic nervous system, which the vagus nerve is biggest part, is responding appropriately, and it can add its nuances into what your heart should be doing in order for you to basically uh, be at optimal performance, if you can say it like that. So that when you see that variation, it means there is a very balanced interplay between both your sympathetic nervous system as well as your parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is your flight and fight responses, so the stress responses, and then parasympathetic nervous system, the one that involves vagus nerve, is your rest and digest responses. So that's where your body is toning down and relaxing. Okay, so high heart rate variability is a sign of a very well balanced autonomic nervous system. Conversely, when that is being reduced, I'm getting gust of wind. Conversely, when that is affected, that can be linked to health problems, and they mention numerous health problems. Obviously, you can think of when you have low heart rate variability, that can be linked to problems with your heart. Clearly, that can be also involved with the problems with your autonomic nervous system, so the part of dysautonomia, and we discussed that in one of the past videos as well. And but they even mention other conditions such as cancer and Alzheimer's disease. So clearly, heart rate variability is very important and valuable for that to be good. So how do you measure heart rate variability? You basically you measure that with echocardiogram. So, and you need to do it for at least 5 minutes at a specific frequency of collecting data. And even when you do the echocardiogram, you have to do it appropriately, meaning you have to be as super still as possible. You ideally want to sit down so you're motionless. You close your eyes, you rest your arms on your knees are at 90-degree angle. You rest your arms on your thighs, and even suggested if you want as minimal influences, so that you can really pinpoint how your sympathetic nervous system interacts with parasympathetic system. You just want to have internal inputs only and nothing external. So you want to be as calm as possible. You're supposed to rest in that position for at least 5 minutes so you can calm down, and then you can start measuring. So God forbid if you have some cute puppy running into a room in that moment, because there goes your heart rate variability for sure, because that's how easy you can be distracted, and your heart rate will reflect that. Literally, your heart rate can spell all of your emotions that you're going through, as well as physiological processes, and your heart rate will literally tell the story in the number of heartbeats. So and even then, you're not done with echocardiogram. Unfortunately, you always need experts, because you need to process that data with specific type of softwares that can extract that information. I will tell you that in my studies, I came across one software that was mentioned that is freely available to researchers was Cubios, I believe is how it's pronounced. I don't know. And then even then you still have to remove certain peaks because they're not natural. So you can have either technical problems or physiological issues. So technical problems is the electrode wasn't attached properly, or you moved excessively. Yeah, this is that puppy influence, right? The cute puppy influence. Or physiological is because you had atrial fibrillation kick in, or you sighed, or you took a or you coughed, and all of that influences your heart. So that's how you'd measure. So if you look at the heart rate, typically we all are familiar with this concept of beep, 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 right? Which you would think you want regular, but as I'm telling you, want that variation in there to determine that it is your autonomic nervous system is working properly. And what you need to measure is, when I say that beep, that peak of your heartbeat determines one heartbeat. That peak determines heartbeat. What you really want to determine is those distances between those peaks, and also how many of those peaks you might have in a different in amount of time. So there's two domains that you measure in heart rate variability. One of them is the time domain. So this is all about the time in between those peaks. Those peaks are called R points, and then the other domain is the frequency, or how many of these peaks are you going to produce with your heart in a given time slot. Okay, and we're gonna get into the details of this. So how did the authors measure this? So they basically what did they do? So that's heart rate variability. We're going to get a little bit more technical so I can actually explain. Ooh, big wind. So I can explain to you what the data they're showing. So what they did is they took college students and basically, oh no, more wind. And basically, so young, healthy individuals. So you can measure a very healthy, good heart rate variability. They told them not to exercise, not to do any drugs such as alcohol, not to smoke, 5 hours prior to their measurements. So because I guess these can influence your heart rate variability for maybe lengthy periods of time. So That was the goal. And they did two types of experiments. In one experiment, they basically used that instrument by the company called Parasim. That's the company that is sponsoring my videos. And but I showed you what the instrument looks like in one of my prior videos, and it's this sleek, sexy instrument device. And it doesn't look anything, the one that they use in research doesn't look anything like it. And they basically use students where they clipped it into the right area of the ear, which is on the tragus, and now it would truly will stimulate the vagus nerve, versus right here on the lobe. There, we know that the vagus nerve does not innervate there. These students didn't know this, so they thought they're getting the real deal, but it's control, it's a sham. And so that allows you to see what happens between if you truly stimulate the vagus nerve versus not. And those who were not stimulated, they still thought they were being stimulated, right? And so that was, and they basically wanted to measure different elements of heart rate variability, and they wanted to simply, the hypothesis was that activation of this device via this auricular branch of your vagus nerve will increase heart rate variability. And that's a legitimate hypothesis because not necessarily all instruments could achieve that, right? So it depends on what the input is. So that was test number one. And then test number two they wanted to do is they wanted to see how different parameters might be affecting heart rate variability, but the parameters that they change, and they assume that by increasing the energy input, they will increase heart rate variability, but the parameters that they chose to test didn't have statistical significance, so we're not even going to talk about that. We'll just talk about the one main experiment. So what they did, of course, they did the echocardiogram for 5 minutes without the device being on, so that they call that baseline. Then they turn on the vagus nerve neuromodulation device, so it was sending electrical impulses to the nerve, and that was basically, that's what they called stimulation. And then they shut it off and they continued measuring the heartbeats for another 5 minutes, and they call that the recovery period. Now let me break down quickly what measurements they took. So they did do that time domain measurements and that frequency domain measurements. So the time domains are more obvious to understand. So the first one, what they did, was what is referred to as, I think it was called root mean square of the distance between those two R peaks. Remember, every time you have a heartbeat, the beep, that's the R peak. Okay, so the time distance between those two heartbeats, consecutive heartbeats, they measured that. They squared it and then took the average, I guess, I think, and then they took a square root. Anyway, that purpose of that, because it doesn't really matter how you measure this, the purpose of that is that apparently information tells you specifically the parasympathetic influence on your heart rate variability, which means the influence of your cardiac vagal nerve component. So that's measurement number one. The second one is even more basic. They measured the percentage of those pairs, R peak pairs, that were more than 50 milliseconds apart. Okay, so it just shows you how rapid heartbeats can be as well. And so the amount that were 50 milliseconds apart, so that's a more obvious in measurement. And again, that apparently tells you that influence specifically of the cardiac vagal nerve influence on your heart rate variability. So you're measuring specifically your parasympathetic. So that's how you determine whether your vagus nerve is working okay or not. And then they did one more measurement, which is, again, they measure all those distances between those R peaks, and they simply determine what is the standard deviation of that against the average. So when you took all these measurements, you take all your averages, what is standard deviation? Standard deviation determines how much variability you have in your data. So when you do that calculation, the higher the number, the greater the variability you have in your data, and the lower that number, the smaller the variability that is observed. And there's different number of standard deviations that can be calculated. One standard deviation usually encompasses 68% of all of your collected data. Two standard deviations will already encompass 95% of all of your data. So that you can use those instruments. But that measurement specifically tells you how the entire heart rate variability is doing in general. Okay, so that's the time domain. Now they did the frequency domain, they did a few measurements there as well. I have to tell you about them to explain the results, which are very cool. And so they did what is referred to as total power. And total power is basically once again tells you what the heart rate variability is overall, and again it looks at those R peaks and takes the time and squares it, and that's it. So that's a simple one as well. But then they did frequencies. So frequencies, what we talk about is how your physiological inputs determine heartbeats based on their influence on your heart in a given time span. So different frequencies, your heartbeat can be divided into different frequencies because different physiological phenomenon taking part in your body will influence that heartbeat more frequently than others. So low frequencies are basically physiological phenomenon that influence your heartbeat every, say, and you measure that in seconds up to even minutes. So that frequency was 0.04 to 0.15 hertz, and I'll explain that in a second as well. So very more seldom heartbeat frequencies, and apparently that low frequency, you can literally just separate it from the entire echocardiogram, and that low frequency actually shows you the interplay between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, as well as other inputs such as, for example, your blood pressure. So, but it obviously influences your heart less frequently. That's the take-home message. Now, high frequency is the one that we're most interested in, because that's the one that specifically tells you how your cardiac nerve is doing, because that shows you the influence of your parasympathetic nervous system. Why? Because that frequency on your heart is determined by your breathing. So your breathing is also regulated by the vagus nerve, and hence as you breathe, when you breathe, your heart rate can change quite rapidly. So it shows you very rapid variation. Even when you inhale, your heart rate can increase. When you exhale, your heart rate can decrease. So there's these nuances there, right? And why, and this is measured between 0.15 to zero point 0.4 hertz. Why these numbers? Because 0.15, we're talking about 9 breaths per minute, so 9 divided by 60 seconds is 0.15 hertz, and up to all the way to 4 breaths per minute. That's basically the parameters they were in which they were measuring these, and 24 breaths per minute would be 24 divided by 60. That's how you get that 0.4 hertz, the frequency. So basically, your breathing influences your heartbeat. You can determine instantly how your cardiac vagal nerve is working. So they did that, and then they did the ratio between low frequency, which is both parasympathetic and sympathetic, divided by high frequency, which is just parasympathetic. And this is what was historically been used to determine what is the balance between the function of your sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic system. However, I can tell you that latest studies suggest that this metric should not be used because we don't really properly understand what are the physiological underpinning inputs into that, and that should not longer be used. But it's been used in science for so long that still 2/3 of all scientific studies in this domain use this information. Another gust of wind. We're in a channel, so we can be disrupted by that. And but nevertheless, the authors clearly used this metric as well, and they used it very effectively to show something very cool. All right, now I finally gave you all the background that I needed to even show you simply the results. So they measured students with sham. In the data that I'm going to show you, that was shown in red color, and then those who actually really had their COVID nerve activated with the device, that's shown in blue. And basically every metric that they use, they show that the vagus nerve, cardiac vagus nerve, was indeed activated, because you could see the response, and that response in every single metric was statistically significant. So you could see that our mean square between the two R pairs increased. The percentage of pairs that were more than 50 milliseconds apart between the two R peaks, that increased as well. High frequency itself also increased. All of these tell you that cardiac vagus nerve is responding to that neuromodulation, and and basically indicates that heart rate variability is also increasing, and the standard deviation of all of the R measurements also increase, and that also is indicative of improved heart rate variability. But what's very cool is that it activation of the vagus nerve via this device, not only did it respond immediately when they shut it off there, and during the recovery period, it didn't go back down to where the baseline was. And in couple of these measurements, that even remains statistically significant. So what the authors call that is that it's a carryover effect. So that means once you activate your vagus nerve, the vagus nerve, that activation can persist even when the electric input is no longer available. That heart rate variability, the benefit to heart rate variability can persist for some time afterwards. In this case, they only measured it in a time period of minutes. And I'm gonna come back to this. But the other very cool thing that they determined was that they claim that they could start potentially predict who will be sensitive to this type of device versus not. So who is more sensitive to such a technique as vagus nerve neuromodulation? And it appears basically the take-home message is that those who are who are who have their sympathetic nervous system more activated already, they will be the more responsive to calm down. So those that are, like, maybe a simpler way to say it, those who are more stressed are more likely to see response to via vagus nerve neuromodulation. And the way they show this is that those who had higher, that low frequency to high frequency ratio, remember, meaning that your sympathetic system is more activated, such people saw a greater decrease in that ratio. So clearly they're the more sensitive. The other way around they showed it is that those who started with lower total power, meaning the amount of time between heartbeats and squared, when those who had lower amount, again showing lower heart rate variability, so more sympathetic system activation, they responded more as well, and they increased total power after the vagus nerve neuromodulation. So very cool way to potentially start predicting who might benefit for this. And this is where the authors brought up that super cool reference that I am yet to study, that vagus nerve is involved in over 100 diseases. So this is potentially extremely important to take advantage of in the future. And by the way, those 100 diseases, they predominate in areas of obviously your heart, but also your metabolic diseases or diseases that affect proper hormone function. So very very big nerve for us to continue studying medicine to determine how best to help people, including potentially helping with in conjunction to other treatments. All right, but now I'm going to give you a little bit more unusual information, and this is to tell you that, well, when you activate the auricular branch of the vagus nerve, so the one that actually innervates your ear, that is afferent neurons that you're activating. So what does that mean? Afferent neurons are the ones that are actually going to your brain. But when you measure heart rate variability, what you're truly determining is how the efferent or efferent neurons, the ones that go from your brain to the organ, are performing. So when you're measuring the performance of the cardiac vagus nerve via heart rate variability, you're actually measuring how the efferent portion of the vagus nerve is going from your brain to your heart and influencing the heart. So clearly, when you activate the vagus nerve neuromodulation device, you're having indirect effect on heart rate variability, because you're activating first brains that go to your brain. So what is going on there? And I want to tell you a little bit about this and give you a tiny background. So stay with me. Basically, and it's believed that those neurons from your ear go to what is referred to as nucleus tractus solitarius, and it's a component in of your brain, specifically in your brainstem. That basically, nucleus in this context means collection of nerves, specific nerves in one spot. So you can think of it almost like a mini brain. And this nucleus tractus solitarius collects information from all over your body, including your vagus nerve, including other cranial brain and nerves, so nerves that come out of your brain, and even information that from nerves that come out of your spinal cord. And it's all these sensory information. So for example, it collects information about your blood pressure, how much oxygen you have in your blood, but it also collects information, for example, your taste, and or information on how your stomach is expanding in response to food intake. So then all of this sensory information is processed by this tiny area in your brain stem, and then it relays that information to other areas of the brain, and then there's a brain response. So then how is that connected to the vagus nerve? Well, it's right next door. That nucleus tractus solitarius is right next door to efferent vagal nuclei. So that's another two regions, and it actually innervates them. So that nucleus tractus solitarius that collects information from your sensory information from your body, it sends little like tentacles, nerve endings, innervating the efferent vagal nuclei. Now there's two of them, they're right next door. One of them is called nucleus ambiguus. That one sends, and both of these nuclei are the ones that produce vagus nerve, by the way. So that's important. So this one, the nucleus ambiguus, sends tentacles down to your neck, and it's vagus via vagus nerve. This is what is responsible for your speech, vocalization, and swallowing, and so on. So this is why when you get sick, your vagus nerve could be so affected. You can start coughing, you can start losing speech, and you start getting horsey. If I can say it like that, like you obviously like your voice is changing, right? That's because your that function is affected. The other one is called dorsal motor nucleus, and that's the one that sends components of the vagus nerve all the way to all the other organs. So that includes your lungs, liver, heart, and all over your intestines. So both of your auricular branch of the vagus nerve sends signal to the brain, to that nucleus tractus solitarius. That's processed then, and only then that information is relayed to that efferent vagal nuclei, and via dorsal motor nucleus component of the vagus nerve. From that is sent to your heart, and only then do you actually affect your heart rate variability. All right. So, and by the way, if you start affecting proper function of these efferent vagal nuclei, that's when you're going to end up with numerous. You can end up with numerous dysautonomia conditions, and so clearly, including such as obviously affecting your proper heart rate as well, right? So that's basically why I wanted to introduce you to that. So clearly we're doing this indirectly. Why am I mentioning all of this anyway? For a couple reasons. So go back to, remember when I told you that there was this carryover effect when they activated the vagus nerve neuromodulation device, there was increase in heart rate variability. We want to see that. It means the vagus nerve is working well, responding, and but it continued to be more sensitive for some time afterwards. So that's that carryover effect, right? And basically they said this has been seen in science before. So one example they mentioned was vagus nerve neuromodulation, which was accompanied by acupuncture. And with the acupuncture, the authors of that publication that was mentioned, apparently they saw increased heart high frequency, which remember shows you cardiac vagal nerve output performance. That was increased for something like a long time. Um, can't remember, but I thought it was maybe even hours. They also mentioned another one, which was where a study that used um, functional magnetic resonance imagery, so MRI, which allows you to start measuring which parts of your brain are activated, and you measure that by monitoring blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain, and then you can see which part of the brain is being more active. And they noticed that vagus nerve neuromodulation activated that nucleus tractus solitarius I was telling you about from the branch of the vagus nerve that goes to the brain, and that remained to activated inside the brain under imagery for 11 minutes after the device was shut off, after there was no more electrical impulse affecting the vagus nerve. So you can see that the carryover effect has been studied for has been seen before. And the second reason why I wanted to tell you this is because clearly it shows you all of this. It shows you that modulating your vagus nerve is not a kid's play. This is, you're doing something really big to your biology, including affecting your heart. So this is why it's very valuable and important to consider using devices that have some form of certification, so that at least some sort of a safety parameters have been built in, tested, to make sure that an individual who is using this can be safe. Because remember, you playing with the very important component of your health. You're doing this, of course, to improve your health, but this can have potential big biological consequences. So it's important you use the right devices. So, all right, I'm gonna wrap it up here. Another gust of wind. So, if this part makes it in the video, then please follow us. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Please leave a comment. Please give a like. Please share. This is how we grow. This is how YouTube likes it as well. And once again, if you want discount for the device I'm talking about, the link is available in the video description. So please check it out. And the last thing that I'll mention also is check us out on Patreon, where we add additional information that do not make it to YouTube. And I'll see you next time in nature. Bye, everyone.